Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name's Alice. I'm the marketing manager here at Wider Funnel, and I'll be kicking things off for you guys today. So as usual, just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. So don't worry about taking notes at all. We'll be emailing you the webinar recording and the slides after we're done. Also, please feel free to ask questions. During the webinar, you can ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer them during the Q&A period after the presentation. We also had a few really good questions that were sent in along with your registration form, so we'll try to dig into those today. But if we don't get to your specific questions, we'll definitely do our best to follow up with the answers afterwards. And moving on, so our presenter today is Wider Funnel's founder and CEO, Chris Goward. He founded Wider Funnel with a belief that great ideas should be tested to prove their value. He's the brains behind the popular lift model and infinity experimentation process. He also wrote the best-selling book, You Should Test That. So I'll pass it now to Chris to get started.
Thank you very much, Alice. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We have a really, I believe, interesting topic today. When we were talking about creating this content about behavioral science and the science of emotion behind fast growth, we couldn't have predicted the situation that would have developed currently in the state of the world and how relevant it would be. And so what we're talking about today is going to be very relevant to what's happening in the world and how you can respond to it. You know what, before we get started here, I'm going to turn on my camera so I can sort of make a little bit of a connection with you, you all there. So hopefully you can see that. We're here in sunny Vancouver. I guess it's actually just me sort of in quarantine in the office here. So what I wanted to, what I'm going to talk to you today about is behavioral science. Now at Wider Funnel, we've been in the business of behavioral science since 2007. We're an applied behavioral science company. And, unlike a university, our experimentation programs are designed to apply to business results. We're not a pure research company. We're not just a consultancy because we actually deliver work and show companies how to gain customer insights. We're not a typical agency because we'll never make recommendations that we won't test. And we're not just a UX design firm. We design experiments and experimentation programs to answer important business questions. So that's the context for why I'm speaking with you today. And, we are founded on the belief that evidence-based decisions get the best results. And since 2007, we've been working with some pretty amazing brands. We feel fortunate to be working with, companies like HP and Dollar Shave Club and Microsoft and Providence and Intercom and Root. And what they see from these programs is relentless growth. And so I'm going to share with you today some of the insights that we're getting from that, but really how to apply it to the unique situation we're in right now in business. So, of course, everyone here is aware right now about the unprecedented global emotional event that's happening with this spread of this COVID-19 virus. We've had tragedies and humanitarian crises before, but this is the first time in my living memory, at least, that the whole world has been fighting a common enemy with such uncertain outcomes. And first, I want to say that at Wider Funnel, we're taking the situation very seriously. We're working remotely to help flatten the curve in our hometown of Vancouver, and I hope you're all doing the same. We're not alone. Everyone is hunkering down, and that means that every business is now suddenly digital. So social distancing and quarantine, these words that really weren't in our lexicon a few weeks ago, mean that everyone's online shopping for their needs today, literally today. And so what I hope you'll understand from this session is that understanding your customers' needs and experimenting to really understand how it works and how it applies is more important now than ever before, because all the rules have changed. You can't make assumptions based on what you knew about your customers' emotional needs 3 weeks ago, because it's different now. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. We're not yet in a recession. It's a crisis right now, but the recession will come next. And what's important to understand is how to thrive through the recession and through the challenging times that are ahead. And this isn't the only threat that humanity faces. And this is what's interesting, is how it's galvanized action like no other threat we have. Think about, for example, how little has been done about the climate crisis. So why is this different? And what does it mean for our businesses and our livelihoods and our well-being? And so that's what I'm going to explore with you today. So I want you to be very clear, make no mistake that the recession is coming. Just like in the 2008 recession, you know, some businesses will survive and thrive and others will not. We're already seeing companies, you know, going under, and things are struggling with for a lot of industries. And those who will survive and thrive, as we saw in 2008, you know, we lived through 2008. I started Wider Funnel in mid 2007. Great timing, right before the massive recession hit. And we saw the companies that survived and thrived are the ones that focused their resources at that time on deeply understanding their customers and building affinity with their customers and building a relationship of loyalty in the middle of the crisis. And it's not having the same effect for all businesses. You know, Amazon just announced they're hiring 100,000 more people to handle the demand for all of the online shopping that's happening. You've seen that on the right here, that the share price of Zoom up 60%, while the same NASDAQ that they're listed on is down 22%. So the crisis is changing people's behaviors. It's not a blanket crisis on it for everyone. And why that's important is that to understand that this crisis is going to force permanent change in people's buying and socializing habits. It's going to last for months, and people's habits will change, and they won't go back to normal. The world will never be the same as it was 3 weeks ago. Research shows very clearly that people are open to changing habits during inflection points in their life. This is important to understand, and what I hope you'll take away. We are entering an inflection point in everyone's life right now. And from our experience, for example, with Dollar Shave Club, through ethnographic study and experimentation that we've been doing with them for the last months, we found that people's shopping habits, again, reinforce that they're hard to change. In this case, we were studying men's shopping habits and found that, you know, when they're used to buying their razors and shaving kits in their grocery store, it's hard to get them to shift to buying online unless something happens to prompt that shift. And that's happening right now. So how should you respond? In times of crisis, you need to be more sensitive to your customers' expectations. Business can't stop, right? You have to keep going in business, or the coming recession will be even more catastrophic. But businesses also need to do good in the world. So what's important to understand is that we're in a different emotional context than 2 to 3 weeks ago. Everything in your customer's emotional environment is different now, and your old assumptions and insights just don't apply anymore. So at the same time, the current crisis is providing a really interesting situation from a behavioral science perspective. We're seeing people act irrationally in very obvious ways that you can observe and learn from. Now, the key throughout all of these types of situations is to ask why. That's the most important question. We've all seen the toilet paper hoarding panic in the news, right? It's happening everywhere. So why is this happening? There isn't a supply chain problem. There's no shortage of toilet paper in the world. This behavior doesn't make sense if you don't understand behavioral science and cognitive biases. You see, people react to their unconscious emotions in predictable ways. They don't respond to their rational conscious thoughts. People react to their emotion, and that's how they make decisions. You've also seen the hand sanitizer shortage, right? But strangely, if you look in your grocery store today, there doesn't seem to be a shortage of soap, right? Which is just as effective, and if not more effective, for the virus. So why is that happening? This is partly due to a brand association with hand sanitizer. The hand sanitizer brand is closely associated with killing invisible germs, whereas soap is most associated with cleaning visible dirt off your hands. So people are reacting emotionally without clear and rational thought. And this is where we get to some really interesting insights. The behavioral insights about your customers and their habits and emotional needs comes from asking the question, why? So when we dig into all of these strange behaviors, we see that well-known cognitive biases are creating a highly triggered emotional environment. We know that even the hint of a shortage of something that we depend on creates irrational buying behavior due to the scarcity effect. This means people place a higher value on things that are scarce. And it's important to understand that this is a basic survival instinct. It's very, very hard to overcome. I've been thinking about it over the last few days and the last week. You know, even though consciously I'm actually thinking about how people are acting with the scarcity, I still myself find myself feeling a little bit urgent and anxious and motivated to try to go, you know, find some toilet paper, even though I know it doesn't make any sense. So it's hard to overcome. And the effect is amplified in crisis because people are surrounded by other people that are doing the same things. So this is, you know, the well-known social proof evidence, which shows us how we should be acting. An extreme case of this is the mob mentality or herd mentality, where people act in ways that they wouldn't normally in large groups. You think of it like riots, how they happen, right? People act very strangely, how they wouldn't normally act. So scarcity kicks in this situation when some people start hoarding resources, which then prompts everyone to feel like they also have to hoard to survive. The social proof bandwagon effect kicks into play, where people tend to trust in something because they've seen other people do that first or trust that. There's a perceived safety in numbers. And I'm going to show you some examples today about how this applies and how you can learn from these elements for your customer experiences and to meet their emotional needs. So as an example, this is a digital experience for a content publishing website that we've optimized for several years. Now, the goal was to get visitors interested in changing car insurance providers. So we were publishing helpful content for people to understand about their vehicles. And then the revenue was generated through changing car insurance for them. And so within this banner, we had tested many, many, many different elements. And I'll show you a few things that were tested. So in this example, here's 4 different treatments of that car insurance banner. One of them is the control, says it's a good time to check car insurance rates. The second one has a micro survey, which creates relevance by showing how their current situation can affect their car insurance. The other one uses generic relevance message, and the fourth one uses a social proof focus. And why this is interesting is because, you know, we had tested many, many variations and found that this social proof focus headline had over 40% lift in revenue just by changing the headline to add a pretty powerful social proof statement that over 1,972,000 Americans had searched for lower car insurance rates. So all of these cognitive biases are things that marketers have become interested in over the last few years. And there's over 180 elements and cognitive biases that marketers are interested in and using within their marketing approaches. But, you know, I want to get away from the idea that cognitive biases equate to behavioral science, because it's just a very limited view. We shouldn't be thinking about using tips and tricks or a bag of tools for how to sort of manipulate customers. That's not the way to think about your customers. What we want to understand is using the methodologies that are available to really understand your customers and understand how to meet their needs, not to trick them into doing something. You know, cognitive biases are important to understand, and they're important to use when crafting, you know, architecting your choice experiences, but they should be used in the context of creating a pleasurable experience for your customers to go through the buying cycle. The goal of behavioral science really is to find insights about your customers' emotional needs that lead to resonance and action. So I'm going to show you an example. This is a social media campaign, actually, for 2 different companies. Now, it's advertising coffee, right? You'll notice that these cups are all have a very similar design. Now, what's interesting here is that one of these is an ad for Starbucks and one is an ad for McDonald's. So can you guess which one is which? Think about which one of these 2 you think is Starbucks and which one's McDonald's. I'll bet you if you go with your gut feeling, you can probably guess the right one. So the question that I find is interesting, again, is why? Why would Starbucks and McDonald's have the same campaign? Their customers are different, right? I mean, clearly they have to be a different target audience. Well, from a behavioral science perspective, these two campaigns are actually very different. So the one on the left is Starbucks, if you guessed right, hopefully. The one on the right is McDonald's. So what's important here is that there are implicit cues within these ad campaigns that give very different messages. And that's what we have to look at. So with Starbucks, you'll see that you've got a single cup. It's on a beautiful wallpaper background. It's very artistic. It's individualistic. It's artfully placed. It's perfectly Instagrammable, right? And the McDonald's one, on the other hand, is two cups in a car. It's, you know, they're on a road trip or something, and they're almost saying cheers with their cups, right? It's a social experience. It's more casual. So the explicit messages are exactly the same, but the implicit messages and the codes that are built into these are completely different. So what do I mean by implicit versus explicit? This is really important to understand. To leverage motivation, we have to understand the way people think. Now, most of you have probably are familiar with Daniel Kahneman and his work in developing the System 1 and System 2 thinking. His book is Thinking Fast and Slow. And so through his research, and you know, he's awarded the Nobel Prize for his research, System 1 is where we're making decisions with effortless thinking. It's fast, it's uncontrolled thinking. System 2 is very slow. It takes a lot of effort, it's very controlled, and it's very expensive for our minds to make those kind of decisions. So most of our decisions are made with System 1 thinking. In fact, it's of the vast majority of our decisions. And there's also another study done in the University of Ottawa that showed that emotional relevance in an experience can be assessed within 50 milliseconds. So you can measure that first impression with first impression testing. So why is this happening? When you think of it biologically, your implicit subconscious awareness is processing millions of bits of information per second. In fact, over 11 million bits per second are coming in through all of your 5 senses. Whereas your ability to explicitly, consciously process information is much, much slower. Only 40 to 50 bits per second can be consciously processed. And so that, you can imagine, makes a massive difference in how much of your decision-making goes on explicitly with your conscious mind and implicitly in your subconscious. And the reason behind that is that thinking is really hard. The world is hard, right? Your brain is only 2% of your body mass, and it consumes 20% of our energy. Our bodies have evolved to minimize explicit processing for that reason, because it's the most expensive form of processing. So the reason I'm explaining this is to help you understand that 90% of your customers' decisions are made unconsciously, driven by the underlying limbic system of the brain. Now, I refer to the limbic system, and what it means, the latest research is showing, is that it's actually a connection that goes all the way through your emotional amygdala base brain, all the way through to the prefrontal cortex. And this is new research in the last 20 years that's showing this, that our decisions are made through a combination of the emotional underlying brain and the explicit brain. So we need to understand these emotional associations that customers are making in their context and their environment, and how that influences their emotional resonance with your experiences that you're creating with them. To do that, we need to understand the emotional systems of the brain and how people make decisions. So neuroscience is showing us that there are 3 main emotional systems in the brain, and everyone expresses a combination of these different systems in different situations. So the dominant system is one that's connected to self-assurance and pride in winning and in sort of dominating and finding new avenues. The stimulants area is more about exploration and excitement and discovery and learning. The balance system is more associated with security and avoiding risk and stability. And what we find is that some people are more aligned with one of these systems or the other. There's always a combination. And in some decisions, there's more dominance on one or the other of these systems. And so we've developed a framework in association with partnering with a group called Nymphenburg Group in Germany that has done 20 years of research on these three systems of the brain and created a model to show this. And we've shown this before briefly, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but this limbic map is a visual representation of the words that are, and how closely they are associated with the different systems of the brain. And these systems are actually physiological as well. They're connected to different neurotransmitters that are actually being fired in different contexts. So, I won't get into all of the science behind it, but it's really fascinating when you dig into it. I'll show you how it's applied, more importantly, and that's what we're going to get into is how do you apply this in practice in your daily life. So when you think about the Starbucks and McDonald's campaign, you have to understand the different codes that are built within these campaigns and how they resonate with the emotional expectations of customers. So when you think about, for example, the Starbucks campaign and the Starbucks brand, what we did is we actually ran a study. We've created a behavioral science study technique called Motivation Lab. And we ran a Motivation Lab study on coffee drinkers. And we selected representative Starbucks and McDonald's coffee drinkers, as well as just general coffee drinkers, to understand their emotional associations with these images. And what we found is that the Starbucks campaign was associated with emotional context around creativity and pleasure up in the stimulation zone. And when we look at the McDonald's resonance, the image was associated more with friendship and sociability. So you can see that even though the images are essentially the same, from an emotional context, they're completely different. The Starbucks ad is more emotionally relevant to the stimulant type of target audience, creativity, feeling good, individuality, whereas the McDonald's is more social. It's more about caring, family, harmony. And these subtle differences create these implicit codes that signal different emotions in the recipient of the campaign. So that's important to understand. Now, as to think about how this applies to your business and your marketing, you have to understand that there are two components to creating this emotional state that you need. One is the emotional needs of your target audience. Different buyers will be more aligned with different zones of their emotional states. And then it's also dependent on the emotional context. The environmental context influences the emotional state. And the blend of these two gives you an understanding of the state of your buyer and how to meet those emotional needs. So the emotional context is very important, and that's where I'm tying into the current crisis situation, that the situation right now in the external environment is completely changing the emotional context for your customers. And you need to understand how it's influencing them. And I'll talk about that some more in a moment. In fact, I'll show you an experiment in just a few slides that's going to tell you exactly how a crisis situation affects digital experiences on your website. But first, I want to show you a study that we did with HP Instant Ink. So they've been a client of ours since 2015. Now, what was interesting here is when we talk about habits, buying habits are very hard to change. And we found this out very clearly with Instant Ink. It's a brand new way to buy ink. And what happens is your HP printer tells HP when you're low on ink, and then HP automatically delivers a refill, and you only pay for the number of pages you print. So their challenge here is to overcome people's habits about how they purchase ink. Most people habitually go to their Costco or their Walmart or wherever they happen to be to stock up on ink when they need to. And changing habits like this is really hard. So we had to understand the people's mentality when they're coming into this zone, and how do we create that habit? So what we needed to understand was first the emotional needs and the emotional state, the emotional context that people are in. And so what we did, we actually did another Motivation Lab study. And what we found is for HP customers, so these are people who own HP printers. They were looking for two major areas within this limbic map. One was in trust and the other was in value. They really wanted to understand that they needed to understand that there was a trusted brand, that the ink was, they could be confident in the ink, it had quality, that the ink would be delivered on time so they didn't run out of ink, that they felt secure about the transaction, that they had good reviews, And then on the value side, they needed to understand the performance, that they were getting good value out of it. And in fact, instant ink is the best value to get HP ink into your printer. So they want to know that they're going to get the value that they want out of that ink, and that it's going to be reliable. But then also, because it's a new type of habit, they need to understand what that implies for them. They need to change their habits. And so in this context, they're really thinking very carefully about the process and about the behavior they're being asked to change. So we call that a disciplined state, where they're highly detail oriented. They want to feel like they're making an informed choice and understand all the facts before they're making their decision, right? It's a considered purchase, even though it's not a high value purchase, it's not an expensive purchase, it actually triggers a considered purchase type of behavior. So they're often in this kind of disciplined state, persuaded by transparent, fact-led messaging, and something that feels too marketing doesn't really work in that situation. So when we then apply this understanding, now what we've got here out of this motivation lab is understanding the emotional context of the buyer and what they need. And then we go back to the landing page that had been designed originally by one of the HP's brand teams. And when we did the study of the ink buyers, we found that the emotional associations with this page were on the crafty, easy, artistic area, the creative area. And so when we map that out, that's up there in the stimulation zone. Well, compare that to what we'd found in the emotional needs zone, which is completely on the opposite end of the limbic map. So our job was to shift the implicit messaging, the implicit codes, to match the customer's emotional needs in that buying experience. And then, of course, from that, we took that understanding, evaluated the page, and created many variations of it to match that emotional needs. And over the period of time, we had experimented to optimize that page. And then we found, reassessing this new page that had been winning, it had the emotional associations more on the area of value, quality, trust, and being easy. So you can see that there's implicit codes here of trust. You see that their arms are almost touching. That image creates an implicit code of trust. The explicit message of value, right? We have to put the explicit codes in there as well. And implicit codes of easy. Putting 3 steps in there for how it works implies that it's easy. So all of these things create the emotional context that resonate with the customer's emotional needs at that time. All right, so I'm going to dig into another model here that can be really useful for you as well in thinking about, so this is a behavioral science model called the inhibiting and promoting pressures model. So there are 2 primary forces in human behavior. One is friction, which gets in the way of behavior. These are the inhibiting pressures. And the other is fuel, which makes behavior more appealing. And unless there are changes in the friction or fuel, people tend to stick with the status quo. They tend to do what they've always done. And what's important here is to understand that most advertisers and most marketers spend all of their resources on the fuel. They do advertising campaigns, they try to create persuasion, they try to create motivation, and often they're missing some simple changes in the friction side. And a friend of mine, Roger Dooley, who many of you know, wrote an excellent book about friction and how you remove your customer's roadblock. So I encourage you to pick that up and give some of his techniques a try as well. Now, actually back in 2009, I created a model called the LIFT model, which is actually a specific application of the inhibiting and promoting pressures general model. So it was the first framework that I created for conversion optimization back in 2009. And the purpose of it was to put you in your customer's shoes, to help you to understand your touch points from the perspective of the customer experience and the promoting and inhibiting pressures that are happening in their mind at that time. So to understand this, I'll show you the 6 factors, starting with the value proposition. And I've explained this, many times before. Some of you have probably heard this. It's become one of the most popular frameworks in conversion optimization. But in the value proposition, there's actually its own fuel and friction elements. It's actually an equation that goes on in a customer's mind between the perceived costs of taking action and the perceived benefits. The perceived benefits is the fuel, which includes the explicit benefits and the implicit benefits. In my book, I call them tangible and intangible benefits. You could call them explicit and implicit. That's essentially the same thing. And the perceived costs, the same thing. There are explicit costs and implicit costs. And so if the customer perceives that the benefits, the perceived benefits are greater than the perceived costs, they'll have motivation to act. And then your job is to remove any barriers to that action. And so the other 5 factors simply enhance or detract from the motivation they have within the value proposition. Relevance, for example, is how the message is relevant to their expectations on the experience. Clarity is how clear the message is, how clear the presentation of the value proposition. Distraction is anything that redirects attention from the primary message or the primary action that you want them to take. Anxiety is anything that creates uncertainty in their mind. And then urgency is something on the page that gives them a sense of scarcity or gives them a sense that they need to act now. And so I'm going to show you a really interesting example of how a crisis situation can affect all of these factors for your customers. But first, if you're interested in finding out more, I mean, this is just touching the surface of how the lift model works. I actually drilled into it in very great detail, showed exactly how it works in my book called You Should Test That. So if you want to learn more about that, you can pick that up probably at Amazon today. If you're in quarantine, you can still order from Amazon. So I'm going to show you an example. This is the International Rescue Committee. Now, what they do, they're a great organization that responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises and helps people to survive and rebuild their lives. They're working in over 40 countries and 22 US cities. And so they came to us asking, how can they get more donations for the great work that they're doing from a behavioral science perspective? So we analyzed all of their web experiences, and I'm going to show you one example of a landing page. This is one of their landing pages. And what we do is use the lift model to analyze all of the points from a customer's perspective after gathering research, running motivation labs or doing studies to understand how what people need in these contexts. Often a lift analysis will be an important part of the process. And so what we do is identify where are their problems on the page. So in terms of relevance, there isn't a whole lot of information on this page about the organization and the great work that they're doing and how the money is spent. There's some distraction elements, some clarity elements. The form is pushed down the page, so it's not clear immediately that you can donate on the page. There's a visual barrier, so it might seem like these topics are separated. A large form, which can create anxiety and can seem daunting for people. And there's a missed opportunity to have some value proposition components with testimonials, which create social proof and credibility, for example. Many elements, and this is just a few of dozens of elements on this page, as well as the many other pages that were as part of the customer journey. And so I'm using this as an example to show you a really interesting finding from the experiment. And I'll show you how this works. We created 3 different designs for the page. So this one we called long copy intro. It was a persuasive copywritten letter that created motivation to donate. And we added testimonials for social proof. It reduced visual distraction in the form design and made one contiguous eye flow from top to bottom through the journey. The second variation was form focused. So it had the same letter, but the form was moved to the right above the fold right at the top. So it brought more attention to the form. We wanted to understand whether making the donation form obvious would increase donations or whether it would be premature in the sales process. And then variation C was a completely different design where we split the page into 2 steps to gain momentum. And we've seen this work in some situations where asking one simple question and then moving on to the next step can create momentum and to get through the process, especially if there's a long form. So now the question, as always, as an experimentation company is, which one's going to win, right? It's always interesting when we run a test like this. And so we ran this experiment in November. It was entering the tax donation season. And what we found very clearly was that variation A was an overall winner with an increase of 12% in donation revenue. Now, that was great. That was a great win. Everyone was happy. But what was interesting is that as the test was completing, it had hit statistical significance. We were about to turn the test off, actually, and something really interesting happened. A typhoon hit in the South Pacific, Typhoon Haiyan, and it changed immediately the external motivational environment among donors. So a day after the typhoon hit, we quickly saw the results of the experiment shifting. So think about this situation. Suddenly, they're moving from an environment of relative stasis. These are donors who care about the world and about the situations that are happening. Suddenly there's a typhoon, it's an emergency, people are in crisis, and their external motivation completely changes. And what happened is, right after that typhoon hit, the results started to shift. And we saw variation A suddenly was actually reducing donations by almost 16%. And suddenly variation B, that had the form above the fold, took the lead. This is really interesting. So we're curious to understand why this was happening, and we dug into the results. And what we did is we did a deep analysis into all of the segmentation and results that were happening. We saw that for the whole campaign, we saw those that had a high brand awareness, that were searching for the brand, showed during the whole campaign a higher performance for variation B, over 10% increase in donations. And then we dug even more into a sub-segment and found that during the crisis, the search campaign high brand awareness segment showed a 42% increase in donations. Now remember, before the crisis period, variation A, the first one, was still a winner. So if they had kept the same page during the crisis, they could have hurt their results unknowingly. So what did we gain through this? What we learned is that the situational context massively changes the winning customer experience. The expectations emotionally completely shift in the middle of a crisis. Outside of the crisis, the more persuasion in variation A before they hit the form was really helpful for people to understand the situation. During a crisis situation, that information was still good for reference, but higher obvious emphasis on the action suddenly was working much better. Those who are ready to convert, in fact, convert more easily when there's less information. So here's what's important. Seasonality. I define seasonality, it's not about, Christmas and Mother's Day and Valentine's, although those are seasons for sure. It's not about fall, spring, and summer. It's any external event that changes the emotional context and motivation among your customers. And often they create an increase in urgency. So the way to think about this in terms of the lift model is that the current seasonality, which is happening right now in this COVID crisis and in every crisis that happens that affects your customers, affects the external forces in the 6 conversion factors. So during a crisis, external urgency is increased. People are more likely to take action, even without a lot of added persuasion. And on the other hand, patience is decreased. This puts extra pressure on relevance. Your extraneous information can actually cause people to bounce more quickly and find in their highly urgent environment and emotional context, they're not interested and they don't have time and patience to process the information. So you've got to get to the point much more quickly. So how does this apply to you? What are your customers' needs and expectations today? This is where I want to tie this back to what you can do today in your business. You need to understand that a mix of methodologies is needed to truly understand your customers and their emotional needs. I've talked about experimentation. I've talked about Motivation Lab a bit today. There are a lot of tools that you have available that you can use to understand your customers. And we've started to think about this in terms of a quadrant with two poles. We have the quantitative versus qualitative understanding, and then there's behavioral versus attitudinal. Now, the way to understand this is that quantitative insight is one that's you can have a lot of confidence in, that insight is pretty solid, and that you know that it applies pretty rigorously and reliably. A qualitative insight is less confident. You're not sure exactly if that applies, but it's much richer. It gives you a depth and more potential insights that you wouldn't even have a possibility to find using quantitative methodology. Now, behavioral is where you can observe how people are actually acting in response to situations. Attitudinal, on the other hand, is how they'll say they'll act, where they're often not actually accurate about, people don't actually know how they'll act in most situations. And so behavioral can be more accurate. Attitudinal can be more rich and emotionally aligning. So when you think about the different tools that you have available, A/B testing is very quantitative. And if you design the test properly, it can have a mix of behavioral and attitudinal insights coming out of that. Whereas, for example, clickstream analytics, like your web analytics, is very quantitative, but purely behavioral. You can't choose the insights or the questions that you're asking in your clickstream analytics. There are a lot of other tools that you have: user session recordings, your usability labs, user interviews. We've designed Motivation Lab actually to be an interesting mix of behavioral and attitudinal on the qualitative side, where we're actually mixing usability lab, UX insights, with user interviews and emotional context, and combining them into one really unique process. You have email surveys and NPS surveys and various other tools and techniques. Now, the best practice today is to triangulate insights. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you were to get some, say you're taking NPS surveys, right? Your net promoter score feedback on a regular basis, and you find something, a little pattern in here that seems to indicate something about your customer satisfaction with your product. Well, that might be something that you're curious about, but you don't really have enough information to understand even what the insight is. It just shows a unique pattern flag. Well, you might want to follow up with a usability lab, for example, to dig into that in more rich detail to really understand what that means to some of your customers. And so you might understand from that some more of the voice of your customer and what they're really expecting out of that. But even from a usability lab, you don't know if that insight really applies to the majority of your audience. So now you need to go and validate that using A/B testing to validate whether some of those things actually apply. And if you design your A/B test properly, you'll get some new insights out of that based on the variations that you might want to dig into even more. And so you can go back into a cycle of triangulating towards the truth about your customers' expectations. Now, we've actually created at Wider Funnel an even more efficient process of doing this by creating Motivation Lab, which is designed, as I said, to be a mix of behavioral and attitudinal on the deeply qualitative side of the spectrum. And so we can actually triangulate with 2 points by designing A/B tests using rigorous design of experiments methodologies that resonate and combine with the Motivation Lab studies to create insights that bounce back and forth among these methodologies. So, I've given you some examples here and some frameworks you can use. What I want to leave you with today is what you can do today. This is an important time for your brand to make a lasting impression with your customers. Right now, during a heightened fear or threat, people are more likely to change their habits and impressions. You have an opportunity to reach out to your customers, to truly understand them, to meet them where they are and their emotional needs, and actually create some appreciation for what you're doing for them in this situation. One of the most, as I've said, difficult things to do in a business is to change buyers' habits. So if you respond to the crisis effectively over the coming months and experiment even more to learn the new lay of the land, you can leapfrog ahead. So I'll leave you with a few things to think about. One, which is really important, when I'm looking at a lot of my CEO friends, some of them are panicking, and they're really struggling to understand how to cope with this situation. We've had 11 years of a bull run, and things are changing. So first, you can only make good decisions when you don't panic. Breathe, strategize, think calmly, look at the facts, look at the data, become data obsessed and customer obsessed, and really understand what's actually happening, not just what you feel anxious about. Second is question your customer insights and assumptions in this new context. What you knew about your customers 3 weeks ago might not apply. Think about how to get more information. And to do that, use qualitative studies to understand your customers' emotional needs. Understand the voice and that they have and what they're saying about what they need. And experiment more strategically. Ask powerful questions in your experiments that are based on insights that you're drilling into about their needs and how you can meet them. And then use behavioral science frameworks to inform your marketing, right? The 4 P's of marketing is long gone. The old ways of using basic tips and tricks are long gone. You have to get more advanced to understand the behavioral and emotional context for your customers. And if you'd like help with how to do that, to leverage behavioral science and experimentation to more deeply understand your customers, call us at Wider Funnel. Our team is friendly and happy to work. You know, we work remotely with all of our clients, so it's a very safe, quarantine-friendly environment to work together to understand how this is working. So you can email us anytime at iwant@widerfunnel.com. I'll leave you. We're going to have a couple minutes for questions, but I'll leave you with this. You know, HP says that you know, the pace at which we're able to do complicated tests and get through barriers is amazing. Dollar Shave Club said they quickly realized that they couldn't afford to walk away from Wider Funnel. And Envoy said that what they really appreciate is that what we're able to do together is to create the overarching experimentation and insight program the right way from the beginning, so that you know that they know that they're doing the right things. We're going to have a follow-up series of content here to help you to understand in the midst of this crisis how to make the most of it. And we're going to have follow-up webinars. Next month, we have a webinar coming up with Heifer International that's going to show exactly how behavioral science was used to redesign a complete digital experience using experimentation and these rich qualitative insights, as well as some more material coming out. We're gathering all of the best examples of how businesses are responding in crisis right now, and we're going to publish some content in the next few days to help you. What we really want to do is to be there for you to help you do that. There's also this material that you can request now. It's a free guide called Building Emotionally Resonant Customer Experiences. So you can email iwant@widerfunnel.com if you're interested in that, and we'll make sure we get that to you right away. So again, email us here if you need anything, if we can help you with anything, and if you'd like to get pre-registered onto that next month's webinar and for the upcoming content, and make sure you don't miss that. All right. So we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm just going to switch over to, I saw some of the questions coming up during the webinar, and there's some that were submitted previously as well. So let's see, we have questions here from the US Department of Health and Human Services. So this is Rhonda asking, what is the role of empathy in enhancing consumer experience, including conversion and loyalty? What's the role of empathy? That's a great question. And you know what I would say, Rhonda, is that I think hopefully as you've seen in this presentation, customer experience design is completely dependent on a practice of empathy. It's really impossible to create real customer understanding without empathy and without understanding their experience. You know, as I said earlier, a lot of marketers sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that their job is to try to market to someone or to convince someone or to trick someone into doing something. And that really doesn't work long term. It doesn't create the kind of affinity that great brands have. So the only way to create that affinity is to meet their needs, and that takes empathy. And so when we look at, for example, the Motivation Lab methodology that we've created, when we're hiring people and training them into this methodology, one of the most important things that we're doing with our consultants is looking for empathy. They have to have the ability to understand people at an emotional level and to be able to create these kind of experiences. Question here from someone from Accenture asking, B2B is so different from B2C. How do you leverage the right science of emotion to help to win or help your customers in B2B? Okay, yeah. So we actually have a pretty good split in our client base between B2B and B2C. And what we've found over the last 13 years is that there are actually more similarities than differences in the B2B and B2C buying experience. Now, there are differences for sure. B2B buying processes tend to have more stakeholders. They tend to have more people involved. They tend to be a more considered purchase and take longer time. But that can also happen in B2C as well. B2C purchases can sometimes be more considered. They can take more time. They can involve different stakeholders and different influencers and deciders and signatories. And what we find actually is that people are people. They go through the same process of making decisions in every buying experience, whether they're buying ink for their printer at home or socks in their basement, or they're buying an IT system or a CRM system. They're going through the same types of decision making. And in fact, often what we're doing is looking at B2C buying experiences and looking for patterns in the choice architecture that we're designing and seeing if some of those can apply to B2B experiences. And often they are. They're finding surprising insights about how a B2B buying scenario can work very similar to B2C and vice versa. So, I think less in terms of B2B versus B2C or retail versus SaaS or, affiliate versus whatever, and think more about people and what experience are they having and what expectations do they have at every step in the customer journey. And that's actually a more relevant way of thinking about the buyer journey. So I hope that helps you out there. There's another question here from Neela asking, emotional triggers are a superhighway to a person's amygdala, but easily exploited. From an ethical standpoint, how do you feel about this? Yeah. So I think I touched on that a little bit here today. What's important here is that understand that marketers have been using emotion for decades. This isn't right. You're absolutely right. Or I should say this isn't new. You're right that, as marketers become more skilled, they are also more accountable for what they're doing. With great power comes great responsibility, and marketers need to be held accountable for not manipulating customers to do what they don't want to do. For example, there are dark patterns that you can Google a lot about where people use, or companies are using patterns to trick people. For example, like getting them into, I hate it when I go to sign up for a trial for something and I have to put in my credit card. I'm not signing up to give you my credit card. I'm signing up for a trial. To me, that's a dark pattern. When people sign up for a gym membership and they don't realize that they can't actually cancel that, right? They're locked into a contract. You're forcing someone to do something they don't want to do. And so, without good rationale. So in optimization, it doesn't have to be that way. Just because we're experimenting, that's not necessarily the default result. You're experimenting to find out what works better for your customers in ways that they can't describe to you. So people are on a website because they have a need, right? If they're on your website, why are they there? They're there because they're looking for a solution to a problem they have. So it's actually more ethical to fulfill that need in an easier way by removing those barriers and creating a better experience through experimentation. So let's see, there's more QA questions coming in here. There's a question here from Daniel. How do you persuade leaders in your company that pride themselves on their intellect and believe they only act rationally, that's actually emotion that drives decision. Okay, so how do you persuade leaders that really believe that they only act rationally and that's how people act, right? So difficult. What you're talking about is what some people refer to as the hippo problem, right? The highest paid person's opinion. And we've been battling hippo problems for years. And you know, what's great in the last few years is that the highest level executives in companies, and I have great relationships with CEOs and CMOs all over the world, they're understanding now the reality of emotional decision making, and that experimentation is critical to finding reality and finding the truth. If your leaders have difficulty believing this, you have an uphill battle ahead of you, but there are ways of doing it. I wrote a blog post a few years ago, actually, about how to become the champion that your company can't afford to live without. And there are some techniques for how to do that, for how to create small wins, how to create buy-in from to create alliances and to use skunkwork projects to create motivation. Bring in outside voices can often help. So if there's a way of doing those kind of things, you can create credibility for yourself subtly to allow them to save face while creating momentum and creating a story that they can't possibly deny through the data. Luckily, the work we're doing is completely proven through the data that we're collecting. So any barriers can be disabled over time. So we can help you with that if you want to email us. Again, any more questions? I see that we're at the top of the hour here. So, if you have other follow-up questions or others that we haven't gotten to, email us at iwant@widerfunnel.com, and we'll make sure to get you hooked up with a solution for you. All right. So thanks again, everyone. Great being with you again today. And we will be back in a few weeks for our next webinar, and make sure you sign up for the blog as well to get the latest content. All right. Cheers. Talk to you soon.